Just a little background on Elected Officials to Protect America. We are a network of state and local elected officials committed to protecting our land and our democracy, our water, ensuring environmental justice, and solving the climate emergency. We are led by elected officials who are veterans and who represent frontline communities. And our purpose is supporting elected officials to protecting our people, our democracy, and our planet. Our core principles are public stewardship. We believe that elected officials are publicly entrusted to steward our communities and our democracy and our collective future. Courageous leadership, that when there are extraordinary challenges like the climate emergency or threats to our democracy, it requires extraordinary leadership from our public servants. And lastly, collective power. We believe that together, working across jurisdictions, locally, statewide, nationally, internationally, that collectively we do have the power to turn the tides on these issues and solve these global and national problems. Just a little bit about some of the opportunities we offer with elected officials to protect America. On the education side, you can think of our work in three buckets. So education work, we have a master's degree and a certificate in public leadership with the University of San Francisco, teaching values-based communication, emotional intelligence and leadership, body language, negotiation, and that's open to elected officials across the country and increasingly the world. We have an upcoming training and certificate program this December 3rd, 4th, and 5th in Washington, D.C. We also have a media and storytelling arm, a video production arm, a podcast, a newsletter that goes out to elected officials across the country at the state and local level, as well as a podcast. So if you have stories and policies that you want to highlight, we're happy to make a video or promote an op-ed across the country. And then lastly, what we're most known for in many ways is our policy, organizing, and advocacy work, ranging from phasing out fossil fuels to scaling up clean energy, such as offshore wind. And we do that through elected official fellowships to support you in your peer-to-peer organizing in your states or in the issues that you're most passionate about. Our national and regional summits that we do in coordination with the Department of Energy, delegations to the UN climate negotiations, for example, and our work is led at both the national and the state levels with our leadership councils. And we also have a task force that we coordinate with the Department of Energy on IRA implementation. So a little bit about our webinar today. So it is co-hosted by Elected Officials to Protect America and People for the American Way. And it's on Project 2025, and it's focused for federal, state, and local elected officials, as well as funders of democracy and environmental protection. So as you know, Project 2025 is a sweeping initiative that threatens to dismantle a lot of the crucial protections for our democracy, for our environment, for our freedoms, that we were elected to serve those communities. And so our goal today is to help elected officials and policymakers and funders understand what are the dangers that poses to the community that we represent, how do we communicate the risks of Project 2025 to the media and to the public, and lastly, what can we do as elected officials? What are the specific actions that we can take to protect our communities, our environment, and our climate? So we're so excited. We have a star-studded lineup of speakers for today, including the Honorable Attorney General Letitia James of the state of New York, Peter Montgomery and Na Eng from People for the American Way, and Sam Sakar from Earth Justice. So we'll start with our first speaker, the Honorable Attorney General Letitia James, who is the 67th Attorney General of New York State. She has decades of experience as a public servant. She was first elected to AG in 2018. She became the first woman of color to hold statewide office in New York and the first woman elected to Attorney General. Who's been a tireless advocate focusing on protecting New Yorkers' health and environment by going after polluters and those flouting environmental protection laws, and has been a national leader on defending reproductive health care through dozens of legal actions across the country. And most close to our heart at Elected Officials to Protect America, she was an early signatory, as well as she was a council member in New York City on our letter that helped successfully ban fracking statewide in New York. So for many decades has been a leader. Attorney General, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dominic. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today about the fight to preserve our democracy. And I want to thank Savante, Myrick, and the people for the American Way for all that they do, their incredible work for this country. But we do miss him in Ithaca. And of course, all of my colleagues in government who are here today. I want to thank everyone who was on this call today for taking the time to be here. I just came from an engagement in Queens where I spoke to thousands of seniors with regards to what is at stake right now and exercising their franchise, which is foundational to our democracy. Your engagement and the engagement of all of those who have tuned into this call and their dedication are really paramount to fighting back against these efforts and to protect our democracy. As we speak, former President Donald Trump is running away from Project 2025, but he cannot hide. The detailed blueprint for a second administration is something that attorneys generals, particularly Democratic attorneys general, are very much familiar with because he attempted again to challenge our democracy and strip Americans of their freedom and their liberty back in 2016. And it was Democratic attorneys general who were successful in fighting back against Donald Trump. In fact, we won over 80% of our cases, partly because the law was on our side, two, because he had bad lawyers, and three, because the judicial landscape was dramatically different. Now things are different. He has better lawyers. The courts are on his side. And the political landscape has changed. We are more paralyzed and more polarized and more disjointed in this nation than ever before. And so that really is what represents Project 2025, a manifesto, if you will. It represents a catastrophic and tangible change for every American and for all the values that we hold true. And the reason why, we salute the flag each and every day. Under Project 2025, he would permanently gut the federal government with a plan to defund the Department of Justice and all of their dissent decrees, dismantle the FBI, break up Homeland Security, eliminate the Department of Education and Commerce. They would eliminate the traditional separation between the White House and the Department of Justice, making it infinitely easier for a president to prosecute and persecute his political enemies, individuals who have stood up for the rule of law, individuals like myself who have held him accountable. With that sort of federal abdication, America would lose critical protections in all walks of life. And my office and attorneys general across the country stand ready to step up if the worst happens, just as we did in 2016. We're ready. We sued the federal government in 2016 hundreds of times between 2016 and 2020. In fact, each and every day I woke up and the only question that I ask is, what can we do to protect our democracy today? We fought off some of the worst and most dangerous policies. So Project 2025 is not new to us because Donald Trump is true to Project 2025. We sued to block the administration's efforts to harm the environment, to deny access to health care, to roll back reproductive care, to discriminate against immigrants, people of color, in the LGBT plus community, to dismantle all of the rights and privileges that labor has enacted across this country, putting workers in harm's way, denying individuals the right to organize, building the middle class. And that's basically just to name a few of the harms. Individuals who speak about being pro-life would deny low-income children the right to eat free lunch and breakfast. These policies do not represent simple differences in policy opinion. They represent real, serious, and dangerous and direct harms to New Yorkers and to Americans across the nation. But there is a real difference between having allies in the federal government seeking to protect you and adversaries seeking to harm you. And make no mistake, Project 2025 would cause catastrophic harm to both public health, our environment, and our most fundamental. Project 2025 would double down on the Dobbs decision by prosecuting anyone mailing abortion pills, which it calls the single greatest threat to unborn children in a post-Roe world. Medication pills, safe abortion pills. It would open the door to criminalizing abortion care by using the government to track a miscarriage, stillbirths, abortions, and even periods. We codified Roe in New York and other states across the nation, and other states have done basically the same. And here in the great state of New York, we have a ballot referendum on our ballot this year, and that is to codify Roe in our state constitution. And I urge everyone who is from New York to flip over their ballot and vote yes on Proposition 1. But these policies would still apply even in states where the post-Dodd standards were enacted. Project 2025 would hurt our most vulnerable constituents and neighbors by building on the Trump tax cuts through cutting food stamps, cutting social welfare programs, making it harder to get Medicaid, by cutting taxes for the rich and investors and friends and allies of Donald Trump, canceling federal student loan forgiveness program for individuals, for teachers and others who give so much of their time to others, and I need to remind all of you that JFK once wrote a book that said, that indicated that America really is a nation of immigrants, built by immigrants and ever strengthened by our diversity. Immigrants who probably served you each and every day, whose names you do not know, but who serve you proudly and who want the same protections and liberties that we enjoy. Project 2025 would give substance to the ugliest impulses on immigration, and by creating a new legacy to build a border wall that will not keep us safe, will not keep out fentanyl, and unfortunately would only separate families. It would ramp up camps and detention centers, employ the military and the National Guard to deport millions of people who are already in this country, including dreamers who want to continue to dream. Project 2025 would set our fights for environmental justice and against climate change back years to come. Those people, children and communities all across this country who simply want to breathe, want to drink clean water, breathe clean air, and who want to live in communities, environments which are not cancer alleys. Project 2025 would neuter the EPA, would repeal climate policies and foreign aid programs, would deregulate dangerous chemicals, and would privatize the National Weather Service. And all I need to do is have you look at what happened most recently in Florida. Project 2025 has detailed plans that would eliminate LGBTQ protections, privatize government, throttle immigration, and roll back women's civil rights, and purge expert civil servants to individuals who basically would only answer to Donald Trump, loyalists to Donald Trump, and individuals who believe in authoritarianism. We are prepared, attorneys general, to once again defend our fundamental freedoms should the worst happen. But it is up to all of us to do everything in our power to save our democracy before it is put to that test again. We need the chance to keep building, and particularly when the alternative could be the destruction of all we hold dear. And the stakes, my friend, simply could not be high. I know you all know that, but I want you to know that it is truly, their threats are real. And my office and the office of a number of like-minded attorneys general, we haven't been sitting idly by, waiting to see what happens. We're ready. We're prepared. And we are simply just waiting until we get the results from Election Day. Everything is at stake at our democracy. But I want to give you some peace of mind and let you know that we're not going to go down silently, and that we are ready, willing, and able to take proactive measures to ensure that if we encounter a hostile administration and these policies materialize, as we have seen the playbook before, that we will use the law both as a sword and as a shield, and use the wonderful attorneys here in the New York State Office of Attorney General who come to work each and every day to protect our democracy and to protect our freedoms. And then we're prepared once again to do everything that we can to protect you and your families and our communities and our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney General James, for your comments and strong words, highlighting just how Project 2025 would eliminate many of the safeguards, and your words making our country less safe, and for our children, the air who need to breathe clean air and drink clean water, just how important this is for us to, as elected officials, to understand. I should mention as well, in gratitude, that EOPA is a nonpartisan network of elected officials. Our leaders who we work with truly range across the political spectrum. And the reason that we're hosting this briefing today on Project 2025 is that the agenda, as put out, as you just laid out, is so sweeping to eliminate basic safeguards on democracy, environmental protection, and freedom, that whatever our political leanings, that this agenda would impact our work as elected officials and communities in our districts. So that's why we're holding this today, as it's so important. A few questions, if I may, for you, Attorney General. I would love to ask you, based on your comments, what do you think that we can do as elected officials, individually in our districts or in our communities, or collectively? What can we do in the immediate term to fend off Project 2025?
So as I said, I just came from a forum where we had thousands of senior citizens. And my responsibility, one, is to educate individuals about the policy recommendations in Project 2025 and what it represents and how it would pose a threat to those seniors and to all Americans. So it's really critically important that we educate ourselves about the previous administration and how they attacked our communities. It's really critically important that we review the plan, all 900 pages. I believe there is an executive summary and individuals need to be familiar with it. We need to defeat Project 2025, and the best way to defeat Project 2025 is by exercising the right to vote, our simple franchise, and to talk about it and how it will hurt working people, low-income people, how it will hurt marginalized and vulnerable populations and minorities, how it will hurt families, how it will impose terrifying restrictions on our personal lives and our bodies. We need consistent advocacy and focus on making it so toxic that both sides are denouncing it and tying it to individuals whose names are in the document themselves and individuals who have wrote the preface, who are seeking higher office. It's also important that attorneys general be prepared, as we are at this moment, in terms of preparing for litigation, preparing legislation, and preparing political responses to any agenda, assuming that Project 2025 is enacted after November 5th. We also must challenge the former president when he tries to distance himself from it. He's named in it. And we need to talk about 2016 when he attempted to enact it and how he was defeated by attorneys general, Democratic attorneys general, and how we are prepared again to represent the interest of not only this great state, but also Americans across the board. Because when it comes to our democracy, Americans know no borders. And it's really critically important that we stand together with advocates, with like-minded individuals, with stakeholders, and use the law, as I indicated, both as a sword and as a shield. But the best way right now is to familiarize yourself with Project 2025, talk about it in your houses of faith, your churches, your synagogues, your mosques, talk to your civic organizations, join with stakeholders, get to know Project 2025. And once you are familiar with Project 2025, I am confident that you will be on the right side of history.
So much, Attorney General. And I should mention as well that I really appreciate your comments that just specifically for EOPA as a nonpartisan nonprofit, we do encourage everyone to vote, but as a network, we cannot endorse a particular candidate, obviously. But we do, again, want to make sure that we're providing the information on those policies that you were just talking about. So everyone understands what the implications are for our work. Another follow-up question for you. This has gotten a lot of play in the media. What does the end of the Chevron deference, or AKA Chevron doctrine, what does that mean for the Project 2025 policies?
So one, let me apologize. I continue to violate your rules, but I'm clear on where I stand. And so, so I thank you. Recently, the Supreme Court struck down the Chevron doctrine, which said that judges should basically yield to federal agencies' reasonable findings and ambiguous laws. Basically, in the past, we used to defer to federal agencies. Unfortunately, under the recent Supreme Court decision, that is no longer the case, and there will be widespread consequences on so many issues. And I feel the damage it can do to environmental protections, to public health, to workers' rights, to so many critical aspects of our society. But at the same time, I try to remain positive, and it's really critically important that as they struck down the Chevron decision, that we have an opportunity, as we did back in 2016, and as we continue to do, to basically fill in the gaps, to put in plans created by the end of Chevron. And I urge each state, again, to not only look at litigation, but also legislation as a tool to address some of the challenges that we are seeing in light of these recent Supreme Court decisions, including this Chevron decision. And we need to shore up laws and regulations in places where we have in the past come to rely on federal regulations. And so also it's really all about states' rights. And so it's really critically important that individuals understand that back in 2016, we were really successful again in our challenges to the Trump administration. And we were able to strike down a number of his policy recommendations because they were arbitrary and capricious, meaning that his agencies just didn't have the law on their side, but most importantly, the facts were not on their side. And their lawyers, like I said before, were just bad. But things are different now. He's got better lawyers. He's got the Supreme Court, and it's really critically important that states, again, shore up their regulations in their respective states, and that we combat this Chevron decision, which will, unfortunately, we're going to have to use arbitrary and capricious statutes to defeat these unreasonable and dangerous policies. And in the meantime, let us shore up our state regulations and our state laws, and sort of restore deference to experts in federal agencies, particularly given an administration who does not believe in the whole of government.
Well, thank you, Attorney General, and for sharing that perspective also on what are some of the legal strategies here. And you mentioned there is some work that can be done on state regulations and laws, and we'll certainly get into that later in the briefing as well. One last question for you. I know time is tight for you. We really appreciate you making the time. Recognizing again that we are a nonpartisan network of elected officials with a diversity of political views. From your point of view, beyond simply spreading the word and so sharing awareness on Project 2025, what else can we be doing in coming days, weeks, months, and years to be defending democracy and our environmental protections as elected officials at every level of office?
So it's really critically important that we do everything in our power to defend and to protect the right to vote. Voter integrity is really critically important. We have seen, thank God, efforts in Georgia to do hand counting of votes, which was recently struck down by a court. And we've also seen a number of cases, the challenges to how we vote all across this nation. And we're going to see more of that as we get closer and closer to Election Day, early voting, as well as post-Election Day. And as I indicated, attorneys general and other advocacy groups, we are prepared to defend that basic right to vote, and which is foundational to our democracy. The right to vote is from which all rights spring from. And as an African American, I stand ready because I recognize that so many of my ancestors and so many Americans as a whole died for that right to vote. And so it's really critically important that individuals understand what is at stake. As we know, since 2013, 40,000 polling sites have been closed, and most of them primarily were in communities of color. Here in New York, in the last election cycle between 2016 and 2020, I joined with Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, as well as the Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul, and we were able to stop individuals who sent out robocalls that were specifically targeted towards communities of color. Here in New York, it was in upstate New York, where they were calling individuals with misinformation and disinformation, and basically trying to enact fear into these individuals, indicating to them that if they had a judgment, or if in fact they owed some traffic tickets, that they could not vote and they would get arrested. We were able to get convictions against those individuals thanks to Dana Nessel, and I was able to get civil penalties along with AG Raoul in Illinois. It's this dangerous trend that will only accelerate as we go forward. There's a lot of misinformation on social media. We have written to all social media platforms with respect to voter disenfranchisement and voter information. It's really important that individuals understand that voter disenfranchisement is the cornerstone of some efforts to basically establish permanent minority rule, and to invoke fear, again, in the lives of particularly people of color, and marginalized and vulnerable populations. We have seen, these threats to intimidate voters of color and to use, again, these robocalls to spread information. And we've seen efforts to bully poll workers, and we've seen death threats leveled at public servants and Secretary of States. So we must fight back with every lawful means at our disposal. We also need to reach out to law enforcement in our respective states. We need to inform them of the law. We need to reach out to our National Guards. We need to be reminded of the fact that we enjoy a federalist system where we share dual powers with the federal government, state governments. We need to reach out to law enforcement and let them know, advise them of their rights. We need to protect poll sites. We need to get volunteers out there each and every day. Here in the great state of New York, and I hope other states do something similar, we enacted the New York Voting Rights Act, similar to the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill, which unfortunately is still pending in Congress. And hopefully, again, I know this is supposed to be nonpartisan, but Hakeem Jeffries is my neighbor and my Congress member, and I hope one day that he will be our speaker. But we in New York enacted the New York Voting Rights Act, which will implement the largest pre-clearance since the Supreme Court gutted Article 5. So here in New York, it authorizes my office, the Office of the Attorney General, that when there ever is any single primary or general election change, it has to be subject to pre-clearance. And my office also operates an election hotline number, and we have volunteers who address concerns on the ground. We've gone after bad actors before. We are prepared to go after bad actors again. We are committed to protecting the most essential and basic right to vote. But I urge other states, again, to look at New York's Voting Rights Act, again, which is the largest pre-clearance effort since the Supreme Court gutted Article 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And it, again, provides this Attorney General with the ability to review changes that's going to have an impact in certain communities all across the state of New York, and that requires pre-clearance by this office. And I urge everyone and all of us to dig in and to protect that most basic right, and to remember all that is at stake in this election. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Attorney General James, again, for joining us as our featured speaker and for sharing this critical information. And more importantly, thank you for your leadership, truly, for protecting democracy, the right to vote, the election manipulation, fighting that as you so eloquently outlined as a legal strategy. And great, and again, on behalf of elected officials to protect America, thank you for your early support with us as an organization since you signed on our letter as elected officials to protect New York to fight fracking successfully in New York State. We've grown coast to coast together with you, and so we've been really grateful for your being such a steadfast supporter and leader along that journey. And we look forward to working together with you, continued on these critical issues to protect our democracy and our lands and our water and our people. So thank you so much. We know you have to hop off with a busy schedule, but thank you so much for joining us, Attorney General.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, well, we'll move right along. We thank again the Attorney General. We'll move right along to our next speaker, who is Peter Montgomery with the People for the American Way. Peter has been a scholar on the religious right movement for more than 2 decades, has written extensively about marriage equality, religious liberty, and other conflicts at the intersections between politics and religion and LGBTQ issues, has been cited as a national expert in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, New Yorker, and has appeared on national broadcasts like MSNBC and NPR. So with that, I'll hand it over to Peter, who's the research director for the People for the American Way. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Appreciate it. I am going to just do a quick introduction. People for the American Way Foundation is a national progressive advocacy organization that inspires and mobilizes Americans to defend freedom, justice, and democracy from those who threaten to take those away. And the Young Elected Officials Network unites and supports elected officials age 40 and under who share a passion for building communities that reflect the values of freedom, fairness, and opportunity for all. The YEO network includes more than 1,300 elected officials across the country and offices ranging from local school board to the U.S. Congress. And I'm really happy to be here today because groups like YEO Network and the Elected Officials to Protect America give me hope. Because Project 2025 does not give me hope. It gives me dread. But let me start sharing my screen and we can I can get through my presentation here. Okay. Okay.
Great. And I should say, very grateful to People for the American Way and the Young Elected Officials Network, as I was a proud member and continue to be a proud alum. So thank you, Peter.
Okay. Am I okay on the screen?
Yep, it looks great.
Great. Okay. So Project 2025 is what we're here to talk about, and I'm going to start with what a couple folks have said about it. This is historian Heather Cox Richardson calling it a playbook to end American democracy, and columnist Will Blanch calls it a blueprint for destroying the planet. So where did this come from? In 2022, on the same day that the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the Heritage Foundation announced that more than 20 organizations had joined its 2025 Presidential Transition Project. It was a mix of anti-regulation groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council and Competitive Enterprise Institute, along with Christian nationalist organizations and newer MAGA movement groups. Heritage was not subtle about its ambitions. It said Project 2025 would position the movement to take the reins of government. Now, that coalition produced a detailed policy agenda that was released last year. It is stunning in its arrogance and terrifying in its scope and potential impact, as we heard some from Attorney General James. But I want to step back just a second. Project 2025 is the result of more than 50 years of strategizing and power building by interests that want to undermine the federal government's ability to regulate corporate behavior. In 1972, Lewis Powell, who had not yet been nominated to the Supreme Court, wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce warning that American institutions were being taken over by forces he thought were hostile to free enterprise, and he urged corporate America to fight back. And they did. And right-wing foundations, fossil fuel companies, and others have invested billions of dollars in constructing a massive network of think tanks, legal and political groups, and media outlets, including the Heritage Foundation, the host to Project 2025. These groups collectively are the ideological heirs of the forces that resisted the New Deal, which some of them are out to repeal. So the image behind this text is from the Heritage Foundation's celebration of its 50th anniversary last year. And the quote, "Rome wasn't burned in a day," is an inside joke at the Federalist Society about the long-term nature of their campaign to dismantle much of what the federal government does. And that sentiment was echoed in the original subtitle for Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts' latest book, and that subtitle was "Burning Down Washington to Save America." Now, to build power, these anti-regulatory groups made political alliances with religious right groups that defended racial segregation, resist feminism, want to repeal and reverse gains toward LGBTQ equality, and many other things. And so all these groups and coalitions are part now of Project 2025, which has more than 100 organizations involved in it. So these are the main components of Project 2025. The policy agenda runs some 900 pages. It's extremely detailed with chapters for different executive branch departments and agencies, and it's available online. You could download your own copy if you want to read it for yourself. Fortunately, a lot of journalists and public interest organizations have read it and analyzed it. And we're going to leave you with a list of really good resources on different aspects of this policy agenda. The second item, the 180-day playbook, they have not made public. This is a secret plan for actually implementing their intention to do so much, so fast, to try to overwhelm legal and political opposition. What executive orders to sign on day one, who to fire, which offices to get rid of, you name it, the game plan. And then the third piece there I've called purge and replace. And at the core of their effort to carry out Project 2025 is a plan to have a like-minded president issue an executive order stripping tens of thousands of federal employees of civil service protections so they can be fired at will and replaced. Project 2025 is in the process of recruiting, vetting, and training ideological warriors to serve as potential replacements for all those fired civil servants, along with the 4,000 or so political positions that any president gets to fill. I saw the Heritage Foundation recruiting for Project 2025 at this year's Conservative Political Action Conference. I've seen Steve Bannon using his War Room podcast to encourage his followers to sign up. And this is the words of Paul Dance, who until recently was the director of Project 2025. And this is how he described their personnel policies. They're systematically preparing to march into office and bring a new army, aligned, trained, and essentially weaponized conservatives ready to do battle against the deep state. Now, one characteristic of the right-wing movement in the United States today, including groups participating in Project 2025, is their open admiration for authoritarian dictatorial leaders, from Russia's Vladimir Putin to Hungary's Viktor Orban. The picture I've put up here is Steve Bannon, a former White House aide, who is a close ally to Orban, one of many in the US today. Orban has used his power to dismantle checks and balances, to crush or co-opt civil society organizations, the judiciary, and the media. And all of that is important to know because the Heritage Foundation president, Kevin Roberts, calls Orban's government the model that they are hoping to follow once they get a like-minded and equally ambitious president in place. And that should be chilling to people who love freedom. Project 2025 endorses a right-wing constitutional theory called the unitary executive, which would essentially put the executive branch under virtually dictatorial control of a president who shares their philosophy. They want to dismantle checks and balances. They even set the stage for a president to invoke the Insurrection Act and deploy U.S. military forces against Americans who might protest his actions. So in the words of one Project 2025 leader, Russ Vought, they want to identify any pockets of independence in the executive branch and seize them. That would allow a future president to turn the Justice Department, the FBI, even independent agencies like the Federal Communications Commission into weapons against their political opponents and personal enemies, including media companies and civil society organizations. Now, the ability of a future president to implement Project 2025's aggressive and harmful policy goals is enhanced by the success of the right-wing movement's long-term campaign to gain ideological domination of the Supreme Court. As we heard from Attorney General James, the far-right justices are already enabling the war on federal agencies' ability to protect American workers, consumers, and communities from corporate wrongdoing. And Project 2025's plan to have the president assert virtually unlimited power over the executive branch is especially dangerous now that these justices have given a green light to future presidents that they can abuse their power without worrying about the courts holding them accountable. The forces behind Project 2025, many of them have a longer-term goal of using the Supreme Court majority to pull the constitutional rug out from under much of what the federal government does today, essentially repealing the New Deal, dismantling programs like Social Security and Medicare, and reversing a century of progressive progress. So the big picture is that Project 2025 and the groups behind it want to give a like-minded president virtually unlimited power over the executive branch. And they want such a president to undermine the federal government's ability to do good things, like promote access to healthcare and educational opportunity, protect people from discrimination, protect workers and communities from corporate wrongdoing, protect the environment from polluters. At the same time, they want their president to aggressively use government power to impose their definitions, their narrow definitions of family, sexuality, and gender on the American people. It's a brutal 1-2 punch for Americans' freedoms and for our well-being. And Project 25 is massive, as we've talked about. So there's just time to touch on a few of the changes they want to make in some major policy areas. And I'll run through these. Attorney General James referenced some of them. And then I'll go into a little more detail on Project 2025's agenda on climate and the environment. So in education, the plan calls for eliminating the Department of Education, eliminating Head Start, getting rid of Title I funding for schools in low-income communities, stopping student loan forgiveness programs, and increasing many borrowers' monthly payments. They also call for eliminating rules that currently require school districts to report whether Black, Native American, and other ethnic minorities are disproportionately being placed in special education programs. And they would eliminate affirmative action and criminally prosecute colleges at employment. On voting rights, they would forbid the federal government from taking action against the spread of disinformation about voting and elections. And they would take investigations of voting irregularities, including bogus claims about voter fraud or complaints about decisions made by election officials, away from the Justice Department Civil Rights Division and turn them over to the Criminal Division, which could target voter registration groups and threaten state and local election officials with jail time based on decisions they make about their elections. Opportunity and DEI, Project 2025 agenda reflects, deep hostility to the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which it seeks to purge completely from federal policy. It wants to treat DEI programs as criminal discrimination against white men, and it wants the top priority of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division to be going after institutions, colleges, businesses, local governments with DEI programs. Project 2025 would also gut requirements for overtime pay, make it easier for companies to classify workers as independent contractors who have fewer legal protections than employees, and weaken workers' ability to organize. And it calls for getting rid of disparate impact analysis, which has been an important tool for civil rights reinforcement. On reproductive justice, as Attorney General James mentioned, essentially take decision-making power away from women and families and give government officials control over their bodies and lives. Under Project 2025, it would be government policy to protect fertilized eggs from the moment of conception, threatening not only access to abortion, but access to birth control and IVF, making it a crime for doctors to provide abortion medication, and more. On LGBTQ equality, they would roll back legal protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and use government power to enforce the idea that there is only one right kind of family, a quote, biblically based definition of family. It also reflects the participation in Project 2025 of book banning groups like Moms for Liberty. It calls for outlawing pornography. And of course, as they identify pornography, that can include books with LGBT characters, and require librarians who distribute books like that to be classified as sex offenders. On healthcare, Project 2025 calls for lifetime caps or time limits on Medicaid, which could threaten millions of Americans who have serious health problems and no other way to pay for care. It would also eliminate caps on out-of-pocket drug costs and forbid Medicare from negotiating lower drug prices, which could lead to a huge jump in prices for drugs like insulin. Of course, they have a long-term goal of repealing the Affordable Care Act. On immigration, it calls for detaining and deporting millions of people, disrupting families and communities. They would make it harder for people who are targeted for deportation to have access to legal assistance, and they'd make it harder for people who are fleeing hardship to enter the country legally. On veterans, Project 2025 would make it harder for some vets to get disability benefits. And one veterans advocate said that the massive cuts Project 2025 calls for in the federal workforce would be a worst-case scenario for veterans, who make up about 30% of federal employees. So now I'm going to dig in a little bit on environmental policy. So Project 2025 is in part a propaganda operation to smear the environmental health and justice movement. It mocks climate change policies as, quote, left-wing social engineering. And in this quote here from the Project 2025 agenda, you see it dismisses environmentalism as a pseudo-religion meant to baptize liberals' ruthless pursuit of absolute power in the holy water of environmental virtue. That is the worldview of the people who want to be in charge of environmental policy. So, and the Project 2025 calls for a whole of government dismantling of climate change policies. It would expand the production and use of fossil fuels and actively oppose the shift toward cleaner, renewable energy resources. It would end the Department of Energy support for an expanded electrical grid, renewable resources, and low carbon energy generation. Would roll back fuel efficiency standards for cars and eliminate them for appliances. Prevent other states from adopting California standards on greenhouse gases, and dismantle and downsize the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which it calls one of the main drivers of the climate change alarm industry. And Project 2025 would also halt all efforts by the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development to support climate change policies abroad. And this, I guess the caption on this slide says it all, getting the EPA. So Politico analyzed the Project 2025 agenda for the Environmental Protection Agency, and they summarized it this way, saying it would result in a fundamental shift of agency activities away from public health protections and environmental regulations in order to help the industries they have been tasked with overseeing. In other words, Project 2025 would gut the Environmental Protection Agency. One of the many structural changes it calls for is downgrading the value of scientific expertise in management positions. And former acting deputy director Stan Myberg has said that the goal of the structural changes in Project 2025 is to ensure that even the smallest EPA decisions are controlled by a tight core of political officials who would be free to ignore the scientific and technical expertise of career staff. Project 2025 also calls for an industry-friendly approach to regulating petrochemicals. It urges quick evaluation of new chemicals to ensure the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturers. It would reverse many regulations. In recent years, the EPA has been moving to address health threats posed by PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, which are linked to cancer, hormone disruption, and infertility, and are now widespread in drinking water. But Project 2025 calls for the EPA to revisit the designation of these chemicals as hazardous substances. And I'll note that while some politicians have distanced themselves from Project 2025, once it became clear just how unpopular its agenda is, other parts of the movement are pushing a very similar agenda. For example, the America First Policy Institute says the US government must resist what they call climate alarmists and remove what they call constraints on the fossil fuel industry. And just briefly, Project 2025 also targets EPA's environmental justice work, calls for eliminating the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. It calls for a new administration to stop backing loans under the bipartisan infrastructure bill that are designed to address environmental justice and equity priorities. And its policies on healthcare would restrict access for people and communities that experience disproportionate health impacts from pollution and climate change. So I will say this is not about any single candidate. The movement behind Project 2025 will continue to push these harmful policies regardless of the outcome of this year's elections. They have a long-term view and virtually unlimited resources to systematically pursue their goals. They've told us what they plan to do, and we need to take them at their word, sound the alarm, figure out how to stop them, and mobilize our own coalition forces. Fortunately, a lot of smart people and creative organizations have stepped up to do all those things. Journalists have been covering Project 2025. Pop culture figures like John Oliver and Taraji P. Henson have helped millions of Americans learn about Project 2025, and the more they learn, the less they like. Most Americans do not believe the Heritage Foundation's claim that climate change is mild and manageable. Most Americans do not want to abandon efforts to protect the environment or turn back the clock on social justice progress of the past half-century. Public opinion by itself won't save us, as the current Supreme Court majority has made clear. Still, Project 2025 has set itself in opposition to values widely held by Americans, and that gives us something powerful to tap into. And it's up to all of us to deploy our expertise, creativity, resources, and the platforms we have to defend those values. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter, and for sharing this details about this sweeping plan that frankly is quite startling, and for pointing out also the deep dive on environmental and climate. I think you summed it up with the Politico slide saying the main focus is shifting away from protecting public health and our land and our water and our air to helping polluters. I think that pretty much sums it up from the climate and environmental justice perspective. And I really appreciate your point underscoring this is not about a single candidate. This is not about this single election. This is a blueprint for any president that wants to undermine our federal protections, regardless of what party or political leanings. So I really appreciate you underscoring that and just how dangerous and what a threat it is to the progress that we have made as a society and environmental and public health protection, as well as democracy and so many other areas as well. I do want to say in this portion, if there is the Q&A feature in Zoom, so please use that if we can make it more interactive from this point forward. I think I'll scan this to see if we have any questions. Right now, we'll also have time at the end for Q&A as well. So I'm not seeing any at the moment right now. So I think what we'll do, thank you, Peter, is move right along to our next speaker, and then we'll leave time for Q&A at the end. So we will move on to Na Eng, who's People for the American Way's Chief Communications Officer, and Na is an Emmy award-winning storyteller for greater social impact and is Chief Communications Officer for People for the American Way. She does all things storytelling and content creation and has worked as a journalist in New York City, producing PBS and CNBC, and has received many prestigious awards and honors, including an Emmy. So hand it over to you, Na. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from you on what does the polling say? What is messaging on this? We'd love to hear from you from that perspective. Over to you now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate you, Dominic, for convening this esteemed group together on this important topic. And thank you to my colleague, Peter, who does a masterful job offering a comprehensive background on the origins and the proposals in that massive document, the Project 2025, 900 pages. As Peter mentioned, one of the opportunities that we have and responsibilities is to sound the alarm with using the platforms and reaching the audiences that we have, and we each have them. So I'm going to dive into messages that work based on multiple sources that we've relied on for our own communications here at People for the American Way. I'm going to share a screen. All right. And before I highlight recommendations on Project 2025 specifically, I want to offer a general set of messaging best practices as taught by Anat Shenker-Osorio, who is a leading, sorry, I'm having trouble clicking through. She is a leading political strategist and messaging expert. So when you are speaking to your constituents, writing op-eds, making speeches on any given topic, this is the general approach that she advises you take with people who are persuadables. First, you want to lead with shared values. What is it that you have in common with your audience? And start there. That way you have something to build from. She also says it's very important to name a villain and expose their motivations. You want to avoid the passive voice when you're describing bad things that could occur. They don't happen by accident. There is intentionality in the motivations. So depending on the context, if you're in a C3 or C4 context, depending on what the cause is, it could be specific names, or if you have to be more general, you could identify folks as, for example, greedy corporations or politicians who seek to divide us, but it is important to name them whenever possible. And finally, you want to close with a positive vision for the future. You want to leave people feeling good about the future we collectively create. So now on to Project 2025 specifically. Here's my first key takeaway. Frame Project 2025 as a move toward authoritarianism and the concern that we have for too much power into the hands of a single politician. So according to messaging research conducted by the Center for American Progress, Accountable US, and Upswing Research, the most convincing arguments against Project 2025 tap into this concern about the loss of checks and balances in power. People do not like how Project 2025 proposes consolidating power to the Oval Office, similar to the way other authoritarian governments work around the world. So having a system of checks and balances provides psychological safety for Americans because they believe this can moderate or block extreme policy proposals. This authoritarian frame proved to be more effective than raising concerns about conservative economic policies, for example. A lot of survey responders felt like those were traditional left-right debates that we've heard for decades, while this concern about consolidated power felt newer. One cautionary note in using the authoritarian frame, while it's definitely good to talk about examples from other authoritarian regimes, as Peter did recently, referring to Orban, we do need to be careful not to go over the top and reference Hitler and the Nazis, which can tune people out. The bottom line is that you want to show how Project 2025 seeks to concentrate power and undermine democratic safeguards, which makes the most extreme economic, social, and environmental policies much more likely to get enacted. The second key takeaway is that we need to emphasize that people's freedoms are at stake. Most Americans value their freedoms. Looking at research across demographic groups, age, gender, race, religion, political affiliation, and ideological tendencies, everyone prized freedom as one of their highest priorities. So according to the Research Collaborative, the most concerning parts of Project 2025 agenda for most Americans are the policies that seek to control our lives, decide our futures for us, and take us backwards. So those are all important phrases to use because they ring true for many different types of group. Control our lives, decide our futures for us, and take us backwards. So for example, you could speak in terms of opposing policies that take away our freedom to make the most personal decisions about our families, like deciding whether and when to have children. Most Americans are opposed to policies that take away our freedom to thrive by making cuts to programs like Social Security and Medicare, or giving corporations more control over our families and communities. So when using the freedom frame, it is very important to highlight real life harms to everyday people. Some of those examples that Peter shared, we have highlighted on our website, which we'll share as a resource afterwards. We gave very specific harms that could happen to veterans, to seniors, to voters, to students, to all sorts of everyday Americans who make up our communities. This is better to use over simply explaining the threats to institutions and systems, which are absolutely true, but can feel a little bit more abstract. People are really feel the care for their own freedoms and their own families' abilities to thrive, more so than they think about civil service employees or federal agencies. So being concrete, another example would be if you're talking about NOAA, for example, really offering that this means that communities won't get the scientific data that we need to accurately forecast extreme weather events or to understand root causes. Again, over talking about federal agencies or processes that get us to those outcomes. Rather than talking about cuts to FEMA, you could talk about hurricane victims not getting desperately needed relief and support. So pulling these lessons together, I did want to give a few examples of potential talking points of Project 2025 and the environment. So here's one example. Americans share a belief that everyone deserves clean air and water. Project 2025 would undermine protections we need and make it harder to protect our air, our water, and our land. It would prioritize profits for the oil and gas industry over our lives and our health. I have two more examples. Americans can see how many people have been hurt by the storms that scientists agree are being made stronger and more damaging by climate change. We have started to make useful changes, but Project 2025 would reverse the project we have made, and that means more people will be hurt in the future. So here you can see some examples around being specific, talking about harms to average Americans. And the final example, investments in clean energy are good for our economy and our environment. Project 2025 would take us backwards to the era of dirty energy and reverse the progress we've made in expanding clean energy jobs. Again, that theme of not wanting to go backwards. The third key takeaway I want to offer is that you want to empower people and make them the heroes of the story rather than paralyze them with doom and gloom. So I'm sure all of the climate experts in the room already know this, but we definitely want people to feel motivated and hopeful rather than numb with paralysis and just a very negative outlook so that they can't move on. And here's the good news. Most Americans, as Peter shared, do not support the policy changes proposed by the architects of Project 2025. And that is, there's evidence of that from polling that was conducted last year by Climate Power and Data for Progress. They found that more than half of voters across all different identities, including 71% of Black voters and 61% of voters under the age of 45, believe climate change is serious and urgent. And the folks at Data for Progress conclude that voters broadly reject many of the goals laid out in Project 2025. So that is really good news for all of us, and it presents an opening for us and a major advantage when it comes to mobilizing resistance and encouraging collective action. So while Project 2025 folks have money and political power, their agenda is not popular, and we all have the power to sound the alarm. Elected officials, community leaders such as you, and all of us have credibility. We have our own networks, we have our platforms to educate others, and we have a critical role to play. And we can also invite all of our constituents to join us in that role. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Na, for sharing this messaging. That was certainly a helpful anecdote or antidote, I mean, for in response of just how Americans, when they learn about it, how we don't like it. And I think your points of saying, the takeaways, talking about a shift to authoritarianism, how our freedoms are at stake, how there are real life harms to these issues, and that together, joining together, we can actually make a difference, I think is a really helpful messaging frame on this. So thank you so much, Na. We'll open it up to questions at this point. I see a few questions in the chat, in the Q&A. Please feel free to continue putting chat questions in. One here is, and then we'll just open up to Peter, you, and Na. Why does Project 2025 not have a chapter on the Supreme Court? Since it's so comprehensive, does this mean that the Heritage Foundation thinks that its work is complete there? I don't know, Peter, if maybe that goes to you. Sure.
The Project 2025 is very focused on the executive branch. It's described, when they initially launched it, it was described as a presidential transition project. So the idea is that the next time a like-minded president is elected, they will be able to hand over the wish list, the policy wish list, and the strategies for carrying it out and the people. So it's I think they do believe that they have the Supreme Court pretty well in hand, but that will empower them to have perhaps more success with this agenda. But this is really focused on the executive branch.
Great, thank you, Peter. Let's see, another question. This is specific to New York State, so maybe this was a question for the Attorney General. We can follow up with her office, but to what extent would the John Lewis Voting Rights Act insulate their electorate from threats, particularly to voting protections under Project 2025? If anyone has a sense on the legal answer there, if not, we can follow up at the AG's office.
Sorry, not my expertise.
Fair enough. All right, another question that's come in is, and this is more of a question about the political support of Project 2025, other than J.D. Vance, who wrote the preface. What other senators seem to be supporting this that are still, we know there's been some political backoff since the polling has been released showing this is unpopular, but what other senators are supporting this or championing it versus backing off away from it?
I haven't seen a lot of elected officials embracing it recently as Project 2025. I think you have to look at the movement and the breadth of organizations that are part of Project 2025. It's more than 100 organizations. It spans the entire conservative movement, from the Heritage Foundation to newer MAGA movement organizations that were created by former Trump administration officials, to longtime anti-regulation, as well as religious right groups that are opposed to abortion rights and LGBTQ equality. So I think you don't, other than I haven't seen senators or members of Congress distancing themselves from Project 25's agenda the way that the presidential candidate has, who thinks that this may be hurting his campaign. But these, for example, the Heritage Foundation is closely aligned with conservative elected officials, and I haven't seen any backing off of that.
Great, thank you, Peter. A question, I think, for you, Na, which is on authoritarianism, which is how does understanding this help? To what extent, in terms of, there seems to be, American politics is very interesting with some say, oh, there's the parental models of politics, or family models, right? On the more left side of politics, you have the nurturing parent model. On the right side, you have more of the strong father model. To what extent does us understanding authoritarianism leanings help with the messaging, and how can we best incorporate that?
It's a really smart question, and I'm going to invite Peter to chime in as well. I'll start with a response. It is true that there are probably aspects to authoritarianism that are appealing to certain kinds of groups. So there might be, for example, a connotation of safety or efficiency. Like there are definitely elements that might seem appealing, especially in times of uncertainty and a great deal of change, and people are feeling insecure. So there have been a lot of studies. I can't say that I am an authority on all of that research. But what I do want to share, though, is that even with some of those attractions to authoritarian tendencies, there has been pretty conclusive research that people don't like the part of authoritarianism that strips away their personal freedoms. And so that's why when we talk about losing your freedoms to make decisions about your family, about your community, losing protections, and going backwards, those are messages that are able to break through even across folks who might have some attraction to authoritarian tendencies. But Peter, do you want to speak a little bit more? It's a pretty complicated question, but I think Peter could add some additional context.
Yeah, that is a complicated question. I do think that, part of the move we see across the right, whether it is kind of the increasingly aggressive Christian nationalist part of the movement, the white Christian nationalist part of the movement, whether it is the straight up white nationalist part of the movement. There is a lot of misogyny and sort of desire for a return to strong patriarchal models and imposition of old models of strict gender roles. And so that is something that motivates parts of the coalition that are backing Project 2025. And we know sociologists have done pretty good research in the last several years that conservative white evangelicals, for example, who hold strong Christian nationalist beliefs are also more likely to support authoritarian approaches to government. And they're also more likely to support the idea that political violence might be necessary to bring society, quote, back on track into alignment with, and I think, the idea that now mentioned of the idea of control, of imposing safety, that's where we sometimes see the call for violent law enforcement, even that is, and I think that's why sometimes in our political climate, we see a lot of fear mongering around immigration and crime, because that can tap into that desire for safety and control and a willingness to give up freedoms for that. And I think that's where we run up against. But I think is hopefully more Americans desire not to give up their freedoms and to maintain a belief in the value of democratic governance, even when it's messy.
And just to add on quickly, because Peter mentioned white Christian nationalism, we just finished a creative video collaboration with a social media influencer to educate people about the dangerous reality of Christian white nationalism. So we can send that as an additional resource. There are definitely overlapping intellectual movements.
Great. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Nell. A couple more questions coming in. So while Kate says, while Project 2025 is not statistically popular in terms of polling, the candidate most likely to implement it is. So what can we be doing right now to illustrate the connections there? And then another follow-up question, which is, given how close the election is, no, we're not a partisan organization, so we can't encourage people to, we can encourage people to vote, but not for a particular candidate. Just how does the election play into this in terms of the polling, in terms of the ads? How does that, and in terms of what comes after the election as well, where does this end? Does this go away? Does this continue? The project director has, as we know, has stepped down, but how do we know about the long-term plans, even if the election, if this is not implemented right away? What do we know about the intent of the authors behind this in the long term?
Well, I'll start with that last part of the question first. As I said when I was giving the presentation, this agenda is part of a 50-year building of an infrastructure to support those kind of policies, through think tanks, through political organizations, media operations. Billions of dollars have been invested in that infrastructure, and it doesn't go away when they lose an election. They don't stop supporting it when they win an election. And I think, we can see the model of the dogged campaign to take ideological domination of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary over 4 or 5 decades that has brought us the Supreme Court majority we have now. We can see the 50-year, very related to that campaign, the long campaign to reverse Roe v. Wade and strip Americans of that constitutional right. So regardless of this election or any other election, this struggle over what it means to be an American, what kind of freedoms Americans enjoy, and whether or not we all get to enjoy them, is with us as part of our political system. It is with us as part of our struggle, and that does not change. And you can look at the people who wrote this Project 2025 agenda. Dozens of them are former administration officials. They have been in government and now they're out of government. Many of them are hoping to go back into government. And so these kind of things are never a once and done fight. I think anyone who participates in, the effort to craft policy, sometimes, you're able to build bipartisan coalitions and achieve great things. And sometimes you aren't. But this is a democracy. The political struggle is part of who we are, and it's always going to be with us. And so, yeah, it's not going to go away, and neither should we.
Well, that's a great wrap up, actually, to bring us back to the zooming out to the larger picture here, that this is a multi-decade plan in terms of a political part of the political spectrum. And as we are elected officials across the political spectrum, where do we draw the boundaries of what are we willing to tolerate as political difference and what is not, especially in terms of undermining our very democracy itself. And we don't have to look far to other countries to see where there actually are bounds in place. So thinking forward for we as elected officials and as public servants and as community leaders, how do we best respond? So so we just have a few minutes left. So I really want to thank Peter and Na, the Attorney General, for speaking again. We will do we'll send a follow-up. We'll do a survey afterwards looking for how you want to best, as elected officials and community leaders and funders, stay involved in this conversation. We'll also share a packet of follow-up resources. We've compiled a pretty great list of talking points, analysis on Project 2025. Peter himself has literally written one of them on climate and environmental justice, really analyzing and going deep into what we can do to push back. What are the legal strategies? What are the policy strategies? What are the messaging strategies? And how can we work together for elected officials? And as part of the survey, we'll ask you what would be most useful for you in terms of messaging or policy support or talking points, any communication support as well. So before we close out, maybe a few minutes early here, I want to give last words to Na and to Peter. Anything you want to share to close us out?
No, I think I'm good. I mean, I did want to address the elephant in the room. We are speaking in the auspices of a nonpartisan capacity, but I appreciate the questions that folks were asking. Certainly, if you're in a C4 capacity, you have different options and mechanisms for messaging. But we wanted to offer C3 safe nonpartisan options. And it's really, as Peter mentioned, the ideas behind the movement, and it's the public understanding and sentiment that helps to fuel the rise of specific candidates. So being able to address those ideas in nonpartisan ways, that it might actually be better sometimes, because it really opens the door for those conversations around shared values. So it depends on the context. And this context for us was a nonpartisan context.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that elected officials, like the people on this call, really have a particular ability to communicate about the threats that this policy agenda poses to people in their communities and their constituencies, because you are trusted people. You're in positions where you are because people look to you and believe in you And so I really encourage you to make the most of that and to make the most of the platforms that you have.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Na. Really appreciate our collaboration with elected officials to protect America and People for the American Way, and plus all of the work that you've done analyzing this, putting together messaging, helping us as public servants understand how best to respond to this, and because as you pointed out, now this has very real impacts to the communities that we serve, our districts, our people, our constituents, and our freedoms and our policies that we work on every day. So and thank you most importantly to everyone who's joined. We're really grateful for your work on this, your leadership. We'll be in touch with the recording, with the slides, with all of the resources in link form, so you can take a look at those. Really great resources, as well as a follow-up survey of how we can best support you and how you'd love to stay engaged moving forward. So with that, we thank everyone for participating and looking forward to continuing the conversation with you in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you so much.